There's going to be things that happen in your life that you can't control. You can allow it to drive you mad and drive you crazy, but you make progress by saying, well, what can I control? I'm Michael Mogill, founder and CEO of Crisp, the nation's #1 law firm growth company. I've built my business through practice, not theory. Crisp started with just $500 to my name and has grown to over 8 figures in revenue over the last few years, earning a spot on the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America. Our approach has been to take everything we've learned about generating massive growth within our own organization and help the country's most ambitious and committed law firm owners do the same for theirs. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with innovative market leaders from the legal industry and beyond to learn from those who thrive in the face of adversity, challenge the status quo, and define what it means to be a true game changer.
This is Jessica, Head of Coaching Strategy at Crisp, and today we're flipping the script for another special edition episode to get Michael's take on the fine line between having all the information and operating proactively when making decisions, how to respond logically instead of reacting emotionally to high-stakes situations, and how to navigate uncertainty with confidence and clarity.
The nature of something you can anticipate, like a Black Swan event, is that you don't ever see it coming. Like you didn't see the pandemic coming. It doesn't matter the level of preparation that you would do. Let's say you just did not see that coming. But as you go through more and more of these scenarios, you start to realize that okay, well, everything is figure-outable.
That's coming up on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Here we are, another AMMA.
Let's do this thing. Let's go. You might be tuning in right now. Maybe you're on your way to the office, or maybe you're in the gym, or maybe you're sitting in the bathroom. I don't know where you listen to this podcast, but the bottom line is we are in your earlobes. And isn't this cool? That's the whole podcast format. People ask me sometimes, they're like, man, should I do a podcast? Sure. But people don't understand sometimes, what is the benefit of a podcast? Well, it's another way in which you communicate content. And our podcast is, you can listen to it if you're listening to it. You can also watch it on YouTube. Then there's sometimes the clips and the little video bits that go across social media. There's also on the website, you can read the show notes. So there's a lot of different ways in which the content can be consumed. And it's really just dependent on what somebody's preference is. So that's interesting and exciting. I think back in the day, we used to do a whole lot of webinars. Now it's impossible to get anybody to attend a webinar, right? I'm going to stop what I'm doing in the middle of the day and sit there and listen to some presentation, right? And do it on a weekly cadence. But a podcast, you can listen on your own time, wherever you like. It's been a lot of fun, but this is our last episode. Just kidding. We're going to keep doing this so long as you guys keep listening. We started, 3 years ago at this point? Hundreds of episodes in.
4 years ago.
4 years ago? Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right? It's been a while.
We can't stop doing the podcast. That's all you do now.
It's all I do. It's all I do. Just wake up, eat, sleep, podcast. That's it. So this is the AMMA. You guys submit your questions and we answer them right here on the podcast. So Jessica, how did they submit a question?
They get to text to you.
Is that 404-531-7691? If you text us, we'll actually answer you.
Maybe.
Sometimes it's a little weird, Sometimes they ask for a little picture. And I said, no, it needs to be a question. Just kidding. I'm messing around, right? We've got to have a sense of humor. This is also why we don't run ads on the podcast. So it allows us to say whatever we want. It allows our guests to say whatever they want. We don't want to be beholden. Those that enjoy it can subscribe and listen, and those that don't enjoy it don't have to listen. It's absolutely fine. There's a lot of podcasts out there in the world. Our aim is to make this one valuable to you, to help you level up as a leader, as a law firm owner, to help you dominate, help you crush it. That is the goal. We got different types of episodes on the podcast. We've got our traditional interview format. We bring in experts from the legal industry and beyond, interview them, distill their insights, share it here on the podcast. Then we've got the encore editions. We bring back some of our most popular episodes. The second time you might hear an episode, maybe you were at one place with your firm 3-4 years ago and they're in a different place today. It might resonate with you differently. And then there's the AMMAs. You guys submit the questions. We answer them here on the podcast. So far, they've been business questions, but I'd love it to expand beyond the business.
I don't know if I would love that.
Ask me anything. It says ask Michael Mogill anything, not ask Michael Mogill a business of law question, which is what, the majority of them have been so far. But man, open it up. Be like, who you voting for, Mike? What do you think about our taxes? What do you think about XYZ? I don't know.
The beauty of this is that I'm the filtration system of the questions that make it to you.
This is true. All right, Jessica, let's get to it. What do we got? What do we got this week?
With that, we are going to talk about uncertainty. I understand the importance of weighing risk when making decisions. However, navigating uncertainty can be daunting, especially when faced with countless variables and potential outcomes. When making critical decisions for your business, what risk do you consider and how do you prioritize them in the face of uncertainty?
So any decision that's going to make a potentially exponential impact in your business and or in your law firm is going to come with a degree of uncertainty. In fact, I would take this opportunity to say that if you have certainty around something, then it's either, number one, you have blind spots that you're not seeing, right? Or it's the kind of thing where it has very little upside.
It's not significant.
It's like investing your money in bonds, right? Treasury bonds or like a CD, like where you have a certain fixed percentage rate where it's safe, right? But that oftentimes doesn't have the same amount of upside as investing something with more, uncertainty and volatility. Or maybe sometimes you have this feeling in your gut that this is the right decision. I know it. Okay, well, that's wonderful. I think there's a lot of power to relying on your gut. We've evolved as human beings that can be very, very beneficial. But your gut's not always right. And if you respond that way, then you're going to be generally making emotionally based decisions. So sometimes your gut is right and it's supported by other evidence, right? And it's saying, okay, well, this is a good indicator that I should move forward. But I would still say you want to avoid potential blind spots when making critical decisions in your business, because a critical decision generally is defined. I don't know how this individual would define it, but I would say something along the lines of, if you're right, it's really good. And if you're wrong, it hurts a lot. So I go all the way when I'm facing a critical decision. So I think, if I'm wrong, what is the absolute worst thing that can happen? Realistically, what is the absolute worst thing that can happen? Because if the absolute worst thing that can happen is we go out of business, well then, no, that downside's too high for me, right? I can't bet the farm on anything. But if I'm wrong, well, maybe we lose a little bit of money. Or maybe we hire somebody who, may not be a right fit for the role, and we lose, there's money involved in terms of hiring and paying salaries. There's the training costs. There's investing in onboarding this individual and training them. And then there's also the opportunity cost of had you hired somebody else during that time, would they've been more successful, would the business have grown more, right? So first off, it's just avoiding any downside that is too great that it could ever wipe you out completely. Like, you don't want to become homeless. But the 99.9% of decisions are not that. Really, when you're evaluating risk, it's looking at, kind of like this expected value equation, right? Ray Dalio's, from Bridgewater, he writes about it in his book Principles. And it's just this idea of, you look at things from a probability standpoint, right? So there's the upside of being right, there's the downside of being wrong, and then there's the probability of being right and the probability of being wrong. So meaning that if you have a very high probability of being right and you have very high upside, then hell yeah, brother, you go ahead and make that decision. But let's say it's flipped the other way and you have, a very high downside and you have a very high probability of being wrong. Probably shouldn't invest in those NFTs. Business is not like, it's not like true gambling when you go to the casino, or even like investing in the stock market or something like that. Like, you have control over way more than you might think in terms of who you hire, and in terms of like how you train them, how you develop them, how do you empower them, how you support them. Like, when you do make a decision, if you make a decision in marketing, you control the content, the collateral, you get insights and data back. Like, you don't have to be right immediately. You can pivot, you can adjust things, and it's your business. So you're ultimately in control of all your decision making. So I think I look at it through that lens. And I mean, that's really the biggest thing. I try to ensure that the downside probability and the downside is not so high that it doesn't make sense to warrant whatever the upside is. Like if we're going to talk about potentially low probability, let's say there's low probability of you being right, well then the upside better be so high that it's absolutely worth going for it. Okay. And most of the time you're going to fall into, a situation where, who knows, right? It's like 50-50. So if the situation is 50-50, well then the upside certainly needs to outweigh the downside. We did a podcast earlier, like maybe it was years ago at this point, on decision-making. We've done workshops on it because this is a topic I'm very passionate about. I think we are all, as human beings, we are where we are today in our lives due to our decision-making. And this is a skill that I believe they should teach in school. How do you go about making decisions? Well, it's like, look, nobody taught you like any sort of framework on how to make decisions and how to evaluate risk and how to go about these things. So if your life is shit today, you're very bad at this.
Yes. And I would say another thing is not making a decision is also a decision.
Well, absolutely.
We often say indecisiveness is weakness.
It is the ultimate weakness. It is the ultimate weakness as a leader to be indecisive, because failing to make a decision because you'll say, I don't have enough information. Or you procrastinate in other ways of saying, well, I'm going to wait it out. I'm going to see what happens. Well, that's how you miss out on opportunities. That's also how you just take a very passive approach. It's like there's a saying, we've all heard it before, like the best defense is a great offense. And in business, if you're constantly finding yourself playing on the defensive, well, that's going to be probably in correlation with a very low growth rate or no growth rate whatsoever. Alternatively, if you're on attack, if you're on offense, if you're innovating, if you're developing new things within your firm, if you're developing new capabilities, new skill sets, you're growing, you're improving, now you're on offense. And we've said that on podcasts before as well. It's like, if you're playing not to lose, well, that's going to have an immediate limitation on the growth of your law firm versus playing to win. But people need to hear me correctly, because there's nuance to this. That doesn't mean you should start throwing money all over the place and just saying it's like pasta, we'll see what sticks, and let's just see what happens. It doesn't mean you're just making decisions without any sort of judgment whatsoever or any sort of insight or information. It's ensuring that you're properly evaluating what is the upside, what is the downside, what is the probability of the upside, and what is the probability of the downside, and making sure that equation is always leaning towards a higher probability of the upside than a higher probability of the downside. Or if it's going to have a higher probability of the downside, well, then that upside better be hella worth it. You can always find out who's an entrepreneur by asking them this question. You got to make a decision. You can get a 100% chance right now of getting $1 million or a 50-50 shot at $100 million. Which do you choose? And the entrepreneurs generally are going to choose that 50-50 shot.
Yeah.
Right? But the majority of humanity is going to say, I'm guaranteed $1 million. I choose the $1 million.
Safe.
Yeah. And one could argue that your opportunity cost there was $99 million.
Yeah.
Then on the other side, one could argue and say, well, if the 50-50, what if I don't get anything? Yes, that could also happen. But if I was given the choice and I got a 50-50 shot, let's say at $100 million, all day.
It's really betting on yourself too.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Next one. So unforeseen events are a reality in business. How have you conditioned yourself to respond logically rather than emotionally when these events occur? And what advice do you have for other leaders facing similar situations?
Well, it's like I shared with our daughter, our eldest 5-year-old, right, who sometimes has a lot of very strong feelings. I said, but when you have these feelings, and I have these feelings too, I'm like, here's what we do. Close our eyes. We breathe in. 1, 2, 3, hold. 1, 2, 3, and breathe out. 1, 2, 3.
It's smell the flowers, blow out the birthday candles.
That's right. And we do this at least 3 times. So the first answer to this question is, when you're faced with something completely unexpected, how do you respond logically instead of emotionally? Well, I think it's Viktor Frankl who writes about this, and he says that, he said that between stimulus and response, there's this space. And if you are faced with a situation, your level of maturity is going to dictate, do you react or do you respond? And, it's the more space that you can put in there, whether you do meditation, whether you do breathing or whatever it is, it's just that you don't have to react right away. Interpret the information, accept it for what it is, and then think, okay, then what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? Again, I'm always working on this. I'm not perfect at this by any means. There's things that, that get me all fired up, and you hear some sort of news and you're like, dang, right? That's okay. We all have our moments of weakness, because it's what it is. It's weakness. When you react in some sort of, way, like your temper or you get angry or something like that, it is weakness.
Oh, yeah. And I think a lot of this goes back to even what can you control versus what you can't control.
So that's the main thing.
It's like, even when I see people get so frustrated on a flight or it's delayed or whatever, and I'm like, where do you even have this energy to get so mad? You can't do anything about it.
Yeah. I think it was Hal Elrod, who's spoken to our groups, several times. He's the author of The Miracle Morning, The Miracle Equation. And I remember he spoke at one of our early CRISP summits, and he talked about all this crazy stuff that happened in his life. He got in this massive car accident, was almost on the verge of death. Then he got cancer diagnosis, and it was just one thing after the next. And the thing that he learned was, I think it was his 5-minute rule. The gist of this is that when you're faced with something that just could completely rattle you, can completely just alter the entire course of your life, you sit there with it, for 5 minutes, You can vent, you can complain, you can do whatever you want, like internally. But then you respond, can't change it. It's about having this locus of control of like what is actually within your control. Right? So there's going to be things that happen in your life that you can't control. And this is the crazy thing. I know we've had like a number of like friends just over the last several months that have had like just crazy things happen in their lives, right? From, a really negative like health diagnosis to there's something happening like just in their home to something happening with their children. It's extremely unfortunate. It's extremely unlucky, like whatever it is. And you look at these types of situations and you say, well, like, okay, you can allow it to drive you mad and drive you crazy. And I think there's sometimes a response where like you should be, you could be negatively affected by it for sure. But then, you make progress by saying, well, what can I control? And like, what is within my control? And then in some cases, there are things that are within your control, right? Like how you respond is within your control. The resources that you leverage are within your control. How you go about solving is within your control. But if the situation has happened and you're faced whatever it is, it's like, that's outside of your control. I remember, something we all experienced, the pandemic in 2020, that was outside of our control. We couldn't control the impact that was making in our lives, in our businesses, but we could control our response. We could control how we led our teams, how we work with our clients, like how we led ourselves. All of those things are within your control. So I think the best approach to you being able to respond logically and not emotionally is, number one, you got to breathe. You got to have to realize that there's a space between like stimulus and response. And then I think the other mindset is just realizing that when you're reactive, that is a weakness. And you as a leader, you can become a more effective leader by being less reactive, of just, interpreting information, allowing yourself to sit with it. Again, meditation has really helped me personally. Like whatever somebody finds valuable to them, go for it. It allows you to be much more self-aware and introspective. And then, as you do this more and more, like you start to realize I have potentially been triggered. I'm about to react or I'm about to do this. And you can like stop yourself from doing that before it happens. You can start to see like how your heart rate goes up and like where your thoughts go. And you have to realize like, oh, this is silly. This is just like our body's like, response and reactive response to situations like these. But who's in control here? And it's you. So it's not to say that you're not going to receive bad news and you're not going to experience uncertainty, but you are going to be more effective if you are in control of what you can control.
Especially as a leader too. Calm is contagious.
Yeah.
You set the tone.
Yeah. It's empowering. This was a realization that was so empowering. It was realizing that, okay, I can't control the things that I can't control, the things that just happen, but we can always control our response. And then there's this other saying that it's like, life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. So there's always a lesson in the setback. There's always a lesson in the adversity. And whenever we experience something negative, which again, things happen all the time, like bad things happen all the time. I always think like, what is the lesson here? Like, how do I need to evolve as a human being to be better? How do I need to, to grow, to improve? This is going to be a story one day, perhaps.
Yeah.
Right? We don't even know it yet. It's one thing after the next. You're getting kicked in the nuts, you're getting kicked in the balls, you're getting kicked all over the place. And you're like, gosh, like enough already. But then there's a lesson there. In that moment, if you can respond in the right way, that's where all the growth happens.
Yeah.
But if you whine like a little bitch and you just complain and that's where it all ends, then you miss out on all that growth, all that learning. I mean, how many people have you come across? This is wild to me. They had all these negative things happen to them, or they experienced all this adversity and they never got the lesson from any of it. They never evolved as a human being, and you could just see it on their faces. They're just so defeated. That's what it is. They're just defeated. Versus, sometimes it's like you see people and like they've had these incredible tragedies that they've experienced. It's like one thing after the next. Like you're talking to them and you're like, wow, I don't have any problems in my life. Just after you're hearing what they've been through, but they're so content and they've got so much energy and they're so like, you could just tell that this is a person who's been through some shit, but has taken the right lessons away from all of it. And it's made them better and it's made them stronger.
Yeah. Could not agree more. All right. And to close us out on uncertainty today. So anticipating the unknown is a constant challenge. How do you suggest I prepare myself for things I can't see coming? And how do you personally approach managing uncertainty in your own business?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I like this one. This is a good one to close it out on. Like, how do you prepare for things that you don't see coming? We as leaders, we have this vision of where we want to take our organization, where we want our organization to go. We see years into the future. but it's rare you think about what are all the things that could stand in the way of achieving said vision on our way to getting there, right? It's not going to be a straight line path. It never is, right? There's going to be setbacks, things we can't anticipate. When you see somebody and they just have a terrible day, like you just said, they got some really bad news, and you have to think, you know what? Maybe into the future, I'm going to have a terrible day and I'm going to get some bad news, and I don't know when, and I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's inevitable. It's inevitable that it will happen. It will probably happen this quarter or this year, or at some point, things are going to happen. I mean, you say, well, Mike, that's a very pessimistic, attitude to have, but like look back across your life. Were you surprised by anything last year? Were you surprised by anything last month or last quarter? Like, of course, things that happened that you did not expect, that you did not anticipate, and then you had to navigate those somehow. So the thing that I do, which is kind of sadistic, but it's just what I do. This AMMA, Ask Michael Mogill Anything, is I'm constantly thinking about what are all the vulnerabilities in the business or in the organization, right? So I'll just answer from a business standpoint. I constantly think about like, well, how would I put Crisp out of business? What are all the ways? What are all the different vulnerabilities that, like, all the kind of the things that could hurt us, could take advantage of us, like could just negatively impact us? I think, what if this happens? What impact is AI going to have? What impact could this election have? What impact did inflation have? If you look at the job market, and the labor pool, what could that have? What impact could remote work have? What impact could I think about 1,000 things like this all the time, and I journal and I write it out and I say, well, here's what I would do. Okay. So I like brainstorm scenarios that could be like, okay, based on any possible threat that I can even anticipate or envision. Because I sometimes put myself in the position of, let's say, me as the competitor. Let's say I'm cast out of Crisp. Like they say, like, get out of here. We don't need you anymore. And I have to build a competing business. How would I win? It's like, I may not have the resources. I may not have the brand. It's like what would I do? So I think about that all the time. And you start to basically create contingency scenarios of like, okay, well, if this would happen, then I would do this. And if this would happen, then I would do this. And as you do this more and more and more, you run yourself through, like, I mean, again, I do this every single day, right? As you get through like 100 scenarios, 200 scenarios, 300 scenarios, it's less about the individual scenario. Because again, this is a question of like, well, how do you approach things you can't anticipate? Because the nature of something you can't anticipate, like a Black Swan event, is that you don't ever see it coming. Like you didn't see the pandemic coming, right? And who knows if that'll be the last pandemic, right? It's like, it doesn't matter the level of like preparation that you would do. Like, let's say you just did not see that coming. But as you go through more and more of these scenarios, you start to realize that like, okay, well, everything is figure outable. Like I would figure it out. And that gives you tremendous confidence. And it also kind of strengthens this muscle in your mind where you're constantly thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And I believe that we've prevented a lot of those things because of this way of thinking. Because as I consider all these things, it's like my role today is I always, I kind of live in the future of like, where will Crisp be 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And the things that we're working on now, there's some that won't launch until 5 years from now. But it's like you're putting those pieces in place because you're anticipating where things are going. And it's rare that you just figure out something, you're like this year and then it launches this year, right? Especially if they're like large scale initiatives or large scale directions and pivots in the organization. So I think by doing this enough times, like you are cognizant of the vulnerabilities and threats in your organization. And now you become, let's say, much more, you take ownership of these things to solve them before they happen. And then again, there's going to be things that you don't anticipate, but because you've done this exercise so many times, you have the confidence to lead through like that uncertainty and that adversity, knowing that like in your mind, you have a brain, you can be creative, you can be adaptable, you can be resourceful. You fall on those things that got you to where you are today. And that's what, you look at it and say, look, no matter what happens, I'm not going to be the only one faced with this challenge. If it's going to affect businesses all across the world, well, then everybody's going to be in resourceful and adaptable mode. And I'm really good at being adaptable and resourceful because I do this exercise all the time. So I almost say in a sadistic way, I'm like, I kind of hope it does happen because then it's like the playing field is who has this skill of being able to navigate uncertainty.
It's investing in preparedness and not in preventing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We setting aside the acorns for the winter.
Yep.
It's like constantly you're thinking, okay, well, what happens if there's a cash crunch? What happens if there's, who fucking knows, right? You got like wars going on. You got all sorts of things. Like, I forget the exact quote. I think Charlie Munger shared it where it's like, you can see when the tide goes out, like who's wearing pants, that sort of thing. But I think you just have to do this exercise of consistently assessing and reassessing all the vulnerabilities in your law firm and then determining how you would respond to those things. And it's not just thinking, well, what if this happens? It's saying, well, have a plan. And sometimes these things are like huge vulnerabilities. That's only a matter of time. That if you could start plugging those leaks now and improving your organization now, then it's going to no longer be a vulnerability. Like we've turned vulnerabilities into strengths. Like I remember when we started, kind of evolved from video to marketing to coaching, even recruiting and software and so on. And every single time I thought about what are all these massive vulnerabilities? And I thought, what if this vulnerability, it wasn't a vulnerability, but it was rather a strength? What if it was so good that became, and that to me even got more exciting because I was like, well, this is how I would attack if I were from the outside. But if this was developed and it was so strong, that might become our competitive advantage. And that's how a lot of these offerings have grown over the years. And that's how we develop them even internally. And every element of them, I think through this process of what if you could just be so damn good and they couldn't come in through the back door or the side door or the front door, and it's be a beast. That's how to do it. Constantly think about, not a paranoia sense of what could go wrong. And maybe there's a bit of healthy paranoia to this, in all fairness, but you're constantly anticipating, preparing. And then as you do this more and more, you strengthen that resourceful muscle, the adaptability muscle. And then when you are faced with a situation you never saw coming, well, guess what? You're pretty good at figuring shit out.
And with that, we'll wrap up this one.
See ya.
You've been listening to the Game Changing Attorney podcast with Michael Mogill. If you found this episode valuable, here are 3 free ways that we can help you grow your law firm. Number 1, download the first chapter of Michael's book absolutely free at gamechangingattorney.com. Number 2, you can shoot Michael a text at 404-531-7691 and ask him any question you'd like. You might just hear the answer on the next episode. And finally, number 3, if you can leave this podcast a 5-star review, it will help us gain access to more influential thought leaders and bring their lessons learned here to you. For more information on this episode, see the show notes in your podcast app or visit legalpodcast.com.